Anti-Pakistan protests erupted in Afghanistan capital Kabul. People were seen shouting slogans, raising signs, asking Pakistan to not meddle in the affairs of their country. Take a look. Local media showed hundreds of people on the streets of the Afghanistan capital chanting anti-Pakistan slogans. The rallies have turned violent when the Taliban resorted to firing shots in the air to disperse the crowds. Local media reporting the presence of dozens of women at the protest who rallied outside the Pakistan embassy, holding banners and chanting against what they feel was meddling by Islamabad. These protests follow the visit of Pakistan's powerful intelligence chief, Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid, to Kabul, where he met with the top Taliban leadership, including the co-founder Abdul Ghani Baradar, amid efforts by the Taliban to finalize a government in the country. The national resistance based in Panjshir has accused Pakistan of providing military and financial aid to the Taliban. This is one of the several protests that broke out across Afghanistan in recent days. Rallies have also been taken out supporting the National Resistance Forces of Afghanistan's northern Panjshir province. Protests have been reported in Ghazni, Faryab, Mazar-e-Sharif. The anti-Taliban protests broke out after the head of the Armed Resistance Forces, Ahmad Massoud, called for a countrywide uprising against the Taliban. In the latest protests to erupt in Kabul, anti-Pakistan demonstrators, people shouting slogans, raising signs, asking Pakistan to not meddle in the affairs of their country. Local media showing hundreds gathering in the streets of the Afghanistan capital.
حدود 1 کیلومتر راهپیمایی کردند و خواهان حفظ دستاوردهای 20 ساله و مشارکت گسترده زنان در حکومت.
Local media also reporting the presence of dozens of women at the protest. Protesting in a country ruled by the Taliban takes a lot of courage. Afghans, including women, have been taking to the streets. They're slamming Pakistan over what they call its meddling in Afghan affairs. This comes after the anti-Taliban leaders, the National Resistance Force leader Ahmad Massoud specifically had called for a national uprising. Let's get in further details now from our correspondent Anas Malik joining us from Kabul. Anas, several Afghan journalists who were covering the protests in Kabul have been arrested. What more do we know at this point?
Well, yes, Molly, today Kabul erupted in protests. We saw multiple protests. One major protest that happened that started from near the presidential palace and it went on until the Pakistani embassy. The protesters were chanting anti-Pakistan, anti-Taliban and pro the NRF slogans. They said and they alleged about Pakistan's involvement, and then we saw Taliban resorting to use of heavy aerial fire to disperse these protesters as well. They have arrested a handful of journalists. They've taken away cameras. One of the camera persons from Tolo News, I know of him, he was arrested as well. He's been detained. Cameras have been taken away. Journalists have been asked not to film it. And then we witnessed that multiple people were arrested right in front of us. Then after that, after a while, we saw this protest going to diminishing into scattered protests, as in the bigger protests turned into scattered protests, and then after that we saw those scattered protests taking place along in and around the city. in greater numbers. Journalists have been arrested, journalists have been detained, they've been prevented from doing their duty, and Taliban say that the basic motive, because there is no central leadership at this point of time, but apparently the basic motive is to prevent the coverage of these protests. Molly?
Right, Anas, to protest in a country ruled by the Taliban takes a lot of courage. Afghans, including women, have been taking to the streets, slamming Pakistan. What about the anti-Taliban leaders who have called for a national uprising? Do we know of the whereabouts of the National Resistance Force leaders following the Taliban claiming control over Panjshir?
As we speak, we don't have whereabouts of the NRF leaders. We saw them communicating with the people through these audio and video messages that have been coming out, but there is no official word on their exact whereabouts. But despite of that, people have been coming out in numbers. Today, as I said, the number of protesters, there came a point that there were over 1,000 plus protesters protesting in the capital city of Kabul, and it had women in it, it had children in it, and it had men in it. Basically, people from all walks of life. The protests were being covered by almost all of the press, be that be local, be that be foreign press. And then we saw the use of heavy-handedness by the Taliban, the use of aerial firing in order to disperse them. The NRF leadership has commended. We saw a couple of tweets coming in from the NRF, but as we speak, the whereabouts of the leadership, the exact whereabouts rather, are still unknown. Molly?
Anas Malik, thanks very much for the moment. We're leaving it there. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.